This is pretty good. Here's Bernie Sanders. The first clip. Let's play the first clip. This is a guy from Vaughn Hillyard, who is an MSNBC reporter.
What was that look? That's a totally normal name if you went to boarding school in the Northeast.
I know. There was a kid I knew in Worcester whose name was like Winship something, and we called him Trip, and I didn't understand any of what any of that meant. I was like, whatever. I came from an era where everybody's name was like Sam, John, Dave, Jim, Betty, Mary. That was it.
Yeah, we don't get Vaughn Hillyards in North Dakota.
No.
All my friends in high school are literally named John.
Here is Bernie talking to this guy in August. And I get the feeling, I don't know the story behind this, but there is a sense that he's annoyed by this dude. And even back in August. And if I was Sanders, I'd be a little bit annoyed too, frankly, because, statistically speaking, there is no doubt that Bernie Sanders has been ignored by the corporate media. Not just ignored, but at times where they've had to sort of twist themselves into pretzels to pretend like he's not been in the race. And personally, I think that's helped Sanders up to this point. I think at one point it becomes a liability, but I think up to this point it's helped because if they're going to pay attention to Bernie, it's not going to be in a positive way for the most part. And his whole theory of change, largely makes some of what cable news does, somewhat irrelevant. In that respect, I would also say very different from Donald Trump. Donald Trump was very much a cable news candidate. Bernie Sanders is not. Here he is back in August, where I don't know what it must feel like to have someone just quote to you an absolute fake poll almost, but here it is.
Last thing we'll let you go. Your polling numbers here in Iowa have gone down a little bit.
No, you're looking at one poll, which the media seems to like to talk about.
And so how does Bernie Sanders rise to the top of the polls here in Iowa?
Actually, if you look at the reports of polling since the last debate, guess which candidate has gone up the most? Thank you very much.
Senator. There you go. I mean, it's weird. When you see people pushing one poll, just the latest poll, there's always a half a dozen polls that come out on any given day. Some are more reputable than others, but all people involved in politics, they look more or less at the trend and what the sort of the average is, because that gives you the best notion of it. And Vaughn Hillyard he took it on the chin there. At one point, it looked like he was getting a little bit into Bernie's space, and Bernie was back off, buddy. But here is Vaughn Hillyard again with Bernie. Now, this had just happened, I don't know, like 2 or 3 days ago in Iowa. And he's pushing. It's just an interesting frame. Why do you have the policies you have is what the question is.
Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg are saying, pick us because we have the more practical approach to health care. Why not go the public option route first?
Because it doesn't work.
The Medicare.
And how much does public option cost? You got the number? What's the number exactly? Oh, we don't know what the number is. And the number is, once again, the current system, which they are defending with minor tweaks, is far and away the most expensive system in the world. We're spending twice what the Canadians spend. They manage to guarantee health care to all people. The function of health care is quality care for all, not to make the drug companies rich and the insurance companies rich. It is a disgrace beyond words that last year, the top 6 drug companies made $69 billion in profits, and yet 1 out of 5 Americans cannot even afford the medicine their doctors prescribe. So let me just say this, and that is, I know that it's not easy taking on the healthcare industry that made $100 billion in profits last year. But I think after 100 years of talk, about the need for health care for all. Now is the time to do that. And that is exactly what our administration will do.
Senator, I know you're going to knock on the window. Well, we're live on MSNBC. Could we ask you the one quick question here on this front? Because you're talking about health care and compared to Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden's proposal. For folks at home, we're 4 days away from the Iowa caucus here. There's a lot of folks we still talk to that say they're trying to decide between Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren here. I know we can go to BernieSanders.com and look through all your detailed plans here. But top line, what would you say your biggest contrast is? Why they should go for you?
I'm not into attacking my colleagues. We're about differentiating the differences of issues. And I think maybe one of the major differences is what I have said over and over again, and I just repeated it right now. In my first week in office, we will introduce Medicare for All single-payer program. And in our first year, what we will be able to do is expand Medicare coverage to include dental care, hearing aids, eyeglasses, and home health care. And in the first year of a 4-year transition period, 4 years, we lower the eligibility age for Medicare from 65 to 55. There are millions of people, I suspect, in this community, all over this country, who are so anxious to get into Medicare. And that's what we're going to do. We expand Medicare, we lower it,
Senator Warren
and
also
we lower the
has that
cost
position
of
though,
health
too,
care.
right?
No, it's Senator Warren's position is a little bit different. Check it out. I think her transition period is quite different.
Vaughn Hillyard is just like ask him questions to get reactions out of him, but get rises out of him. But think about the once you get past the leather coat that he's wearing, think about the framing of this. Their plan is more practical, and the reality is this, folks. And sometimes I worry that people are expectations of Bernie's ability to deliver Medicare for all may be unrealistic. But so isn't every other plan. Like the difference in being able to do Medicare for all and the versions that Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden are talking about, from a political standpoint, that it's sort of impossible to assess. Like the biggest hump is to get to any of those plans. But once you get past that, it's like, I don't know. Can people really assess the difference between an $800 billion stimulus plan and what it would have taken politically to get a $1.2 trillion stimulus plan? I don't think so. Would it be harder? Maybe, arguably, but not necessarily if you've set the bar, the expectations higher. Maybe it's always this dynamic. That it's always like, 10% harder than where you've set the expectations. That dynamic where they say like, no matter how much money you make, you're always, unless you're a billionaire, I guess, spending, 15% more than your income is or whatever it is. Maybe that dynamic exists. We really don't know. There's not, the political science on this is really inconclusive. So why wouldn't you go for more? You go for the policy that you think is the best policy. But this guy is framing it as if it's a more practical solution. And Bernie's response is it's not practical because it doesn't work. It's not clear that it's politically more practical. And it's certainly clear that it's not materially more practical. But this is the framing that we're going to hear. We're going to hear this in the debates. We're going to hear it in the general election debate, if that's what it is. We're going to hear it in the primary debates. This is the framing that they always use. When the reality is we are paying more. It's more expensive. It's not efficient. That's the reality. And then, the last comment in terms of his differentiation with Warren, I think he does a good job there because really, I think the differentiation with Warren, and it's indicative of, or I should say it's reflected in the reporting that we've seen of Warren on the campaign trail. People can go check out what Dave Weigel's saying on Twitter. The bottom line is she's, according to Weigel, at the rallies that she has where she's taking questions, she's not getting questions about Medicare for all. And I think in the context of her campaign, Medicare for all is not the priority it is for Warren as it is for Sanders. Now, I happen to think, I'm skeptical on some level of her legislative plan for it. I don't think she needed to present that. I don't think she needed to present the pay-fors and whatnot. I'm not as skeptical about it, I think, as a lot of people are. I think it's quite conceivable that in the 2022 congressional election, House and Senate, the Senate actually favors Democrats more than any other election that we've had in the past, one or two cycles leading up to that, at least. I think it's quite conceivable. In the right circumstance, you could have Democrats maintain the House and Senate. But regardless, I think one thing is clear. It's just not the priority that it is for Warren as it is for Sanders. And that's why Sanders is making a point. Like, a week one, I'm going to do this stuff. I'm going to do it administratively. And I think that's a fair assessment. And your mileage may vary as to what you think is the most important thing. But I think the argument from Sanders would be, once you do that, once you, essentially undercut an incredibly powerful industry and lobby, B, you free up so many Americans, free them up in terms of time, in terms of cost, in terms of the relationship with their employer. That opens up a whole new host of political possibilities. The best theory I've heard about why we had so many sort of like emancipatory social movements in the 60s is because you had 10 to 15 years of what they call the Great Compression, where you had economic growth that was more equally distributed than it ever had been in the United States. And as people gained a certain amount of economic security, they started taking more political power. And I would think, I don't know this for sure, but I would think that that is the theory. That when you look at healthcare as one of the primary expenses that we have as, as Americans. So you rent, your housing, and then healthcare are fixed costs and are ones that particularly healthcare can make you, bring you into severe financial distress. And by healthcare, we're talking, I'm having to take care of my parents. I'm having to deal with them getting into a nursing home. I've got to get a root canal. I've got to get whatever it is. And once you take that off the board, just the sheer amount of time and filing claims and whatnot. Chasing down insurance companies and seeing who you owe in the 14 different places you got to bill if you go to the emergency room. Did we make our deductible? All those things, once those are sort of like off the table, I think the idea is that there's going to be a lot more political power that people are going to have. So, I don't know, your mileage may vary, but that's what I think is the case.